The topic I picked today is going to be a longer one. So if you don't like monologues, I apologize, but it's something that's really on my mind, and I think I have some better ways of explaining it. So let me jump in. And this is the topic of framework. So a framework is a starting structure. When you build a building or build a vehicle or build anything else, you have a starting structure that then influences everything else. The framework of the house influences everything else about the house. And I believe that in a thought process or in a conversation, there is a very analogous type of framework. So the basic framing of it determines the rest. And the framework will often consist of different methods of thinking, different assumptions people have about the world, and different values people have, different beliefs about what is good and bad. And the more we can be clear on what our framework is and what the frameworks of people we're talking to or consuming news reports from, the better. And today I want to talk in particular about my framework for processing different kinds of claims in the realm of energy. And I discussed this from a certain perspective on the last episode of the Human Flourishing Project. I believe it was episode 23, so you can check that out. It was called something like How to Evaluate Controversial Technologies. And I've been thinking about the issue a lot in working on the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels 2.0 and just reading the news on a daily basis. And it particularly came into focus the other day when a friend of mine, Joe Polish, who runs an interesting organization called Genius Network, which I've been a member of, and he sent me a link to the Wired Guide to Climate Change. That's almost exactly what it's called, if not exactly. And I read this thing and I thought, the way this reads, I could see somebody totally thinking, yeah, this makes sense. This is a thoughtful kind of scientific document. And to me, this is worse than worthless. Like, you should definitely not read this kind of thing because the framework of it is so bad. But today I want to talk about, I'm not going to tell you not to read things, but rather to give you the framework that I have in mind when I read things, which then helps me consume better and better things over time. So I'll give you, this is the current way that I explain my framework. And it's even a little different from how I explained it on the last episode of the Human Flourishing Project, but this is currently the way that I find most helpful. So I'll give you 4 parts and then I'll explain each of them. So the parts are: explain the evidence, seek the full context, acknowledge your assumptions, and define your ultimate goal. And these are methods that people who claim to have knowledge and be communicating it should follow. And these are thus serve as standards by which I judge their presentations. So 1 is explain the evidence, 2 is seek the full context, 3 is acknowledge your assumptions, and 4 is define your ultimate goal. So for each of these, I'm just going to quickly summarize what it means, why it's important, and how it is routinely violated. So first, explain the evidence. When somebody is presenting an argument, I want them to explain how their conclusion follows from the evidence. And a crucial aspect of this is including how plausible counterarguments don't follow from the evidence. So I want them to explain how their conclusions do follow from the evidence, but crucially, I want them to explain how plausible counterarguments don't follow from the evidence. And this is something that's been elicited actually recently on Twitter by Scott Adams, who's a really interesting guy, and he's been inventorying different arguments for what is often being called climate change alarm versus climate change alarm skepticism, which is a decent kind of way of thinking about the issue. And he's having different people try to give different arguments and then have people respond. And I think that's generally a good kind of exercise that doesn't happen nearly often enough. And one reason why this is so important, because you might think, well, it's not so important to do this, because really what we just need we need the smartest people in the society to kind of come up with a consensus, and then we need that consensus to be reported through mainstream channels such as the educational system and the media, and then they just need to explain their reasoning, and that's it. And that's certainly it in terms of what's done, but it's no good at all. And the reason is because, or one reason is because even very smart specialists are capable of confidently advocating completely false views. Even very smart specialists are capable of confidently advocating completely false views. And for a lot of elaboration on this, check out chapter 1 of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, which you can see free online. It's called The Secret History of Fossil Fuels, and it documents how very, very smart ecologists and other thinkers completely mispredicted, but with huge confidence, dire environmental consequences from fossil fuel use, particularly that we would run out of fossil fuels and we would run out of other resources. And they also predicted climate devastation in a way that does not resemble at all what actually happened. But certainly with the kind of resources running out, they just got that completely wrong. And yet they were confident, and they confidently said things like, well, we should radically restrict fossil fuels. And yet if we had done that, billions of people who've come out of poverty using fossil fuel energy definitely would not have come out of poverty. So you have very smart specialists confidently advocating completely false views. And there are a bunch of reasons for why this is possible, but just two big ones are: one, it's possible for smart specialists to advocate highly speculative conclusions within their own field, but to advocate those as demonstrated. That's a very common one. And then another one is for people who are specialists who have a lot of respect in one field to voice conclusions from other fields with confidence that they are totally ignorant of. So you can see in the realm of resources, say, people like Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren had very speculative, to put it mildly, views about how resources work. And they didn't acknowledge how speculative they were, and they were totally wrong about that. And then they had very wrong views about the economics of fossil fuels, which they really knew nothing about. And when you combine those, that led to these horrifically wrong assessments. So we need smart people, we need smart specialists, but it's just absolutely crucial that they explain how their conclusions follow from the evidence, including how plausible counterarguments don't follow from the evidence. And all sides in the different energy debates need to do this more. And right now, there's just almost no serious engagement with counterarguments. And it makes it very, very hard to figure things out. So that's one big thing, is explain the evidence. Number two is seek the full context. And what this means is we want people who are making assessments, whether it's of a technology or a policy or a product, we want them to seek all the benefits and all the risks of a technology or policy or product. And that includes, we want precise magnitudes, how big things are, and precise probabilities. And the reason why we need this is because without having a comprehensive and precise understanding of benefits and risks, we can't possibly make a good assessment. It's, say, if we're choosing a prescription drug, we need to know all the benefits and all the risks, and with as much precision about the magnitudes and probabilities as we can, because it could be that the drug has a lot of benefits and low risks, in which case we should take it if it's our best option, but it could be as very low benefits and a lot of risks. So the only way to get at this is to seek the full context. Now, this is routinely violated. And what I've noticed is that it's routinely violated in the energy discussion, with people being biased and sloppy in favor of certain energy technologies and against others. And the technologies that people are biased in favor of, interestingly, will fall into the category of green or renewable or natural. So one thing to observe is that, well, fossil fuels people have a negative bias against, and people tend to only look for negatives and not look for positives. But it applies equally, if not more, for nuclear power, which is a non-carbon source of energy. So it's not just that people have a lot of negative feelings toward carbon sources of energy and a lot of hope toward non-carbon. That would make a certain amount of sense depending on your assumptions about carbon dioxide. But no, nuclear and even hydro have a lot of animosity against them. And this is a really, there's just tons and tons of examples, just easy stuff like, why is it that bird deaths from an oil spill are considered horrible, and yet the far greater bird deaths from wind turbines are generally ignored if bird deaths are a priority? And then another issue is, on is that the right priority in the first place? But even on that priority, why is there this kind of bias? Or with something like worker safety, why is it that people are obsessed with, say, coal miner deaths, but they're not obsessed with the far greater risks of mining for the materials in solar panels and wind turbines? Or why are people obsessed with the safety issues of nuclear when those are documented to actually be less than any other technology? There's a certain inclination for certain technologies, namely solar power and wind power, and often biofuels, so different plant-based things, for people to have bias and sloppiness in favor of those, and then against fossil fuels and nuclear. And this is very common, and it's very destructive. And I talk about in the Secret History of Fossil Fuels how this bias and sloppiness led people to completely underestimate the likely benefits of using fossil fuels and to completely overestimate the likely risks, to the point where you had thought leaders advocating radical restrictions on fossil fuels, even though those were necessary for billions of people to bring themselves out of poverty. So fortunately, we as a society generally did not listen to those people, but those were definitely very, very prestigious people who were not seeking the full context. So that's number two. Number three, which is very related, is acknowledge your assumptions. And the reason this is related to seek the full context is that one of the big reasons why people exhibit bias and sloppiness in one direction or another is their assumptions or expectations about how the world works, or in the case of expectations, how the world will work. So we all have assumptions, beliefs about how the world works, and it's important when we're explaining things to others to acknowledge those, particularly when they're controversial. And in the case of fossil fuels and nuclear, and with this bias in favor of, quote, natural technologies and against unnatural or non-green technologies, there's a definite worldview that underlies these kinds of dire predictions about fossil fuels and very positive predictions about solar and wind. And this is, I'll sometimes call this view the fragile nurturer view of nature, and then the polluting parasite view of human beings. And so it's the fragile nurturer view of nature and the polluting parasite view of human beings. And this view amounts to nature left to its own devices, so if we don't interfere with it or impact it much, is stable, safe, and sufficient. Stable, safe, and sufficient. So it's stable. People will often talk about the stable climate absent our interruption. It's safe. Nature is generally friendly, and it's sufficient. It gives us what we need. But then the idea is, once human beings come along, we're this alien species who acts as a polluting parasite, we just sully it all up, and we take way too many resources, and thus what happens is nature rebels. Its fragile, its delicate balance is broken, and therefore we get punished with a lot more threats in nature and a lot fewer resources. So this is a viewpoint that then underlies different kinds of predictions about fossil fuels or nuclear. For instance, people think, well, if you create nuclear waste, well, that's an unnatural substance. That must have a lot of negative consequences. And they're not too precise about how big those are, and they turn out not to be that big. Or with say, CO2, putting CO2 in the atmosphere and influencing the climate, there is this assumption that, oh, this must be bad and it must be huge. Even though if we look at the nature of the effect, there are a lot of reasons to think, well, there are actually going to be some positives of putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, such as more plant growth. And there are also clearly a lot of positives to warming. So we would at least expect people to predict some positives and some negatives. But when they predict only negatives, and when they predict extreme negatives, that's often an indication that they have some assumptions about how the world works, which is that the world is this fragile nurturer and human beings are polluting parasites, and thus they expect human impacts to be negative and catastrophic for all of nature, including us. Whereas my own view is that I'd not summarize nature as a fragile nurturer. I'd summarize it as wild potential. So I view it as nature is dynamic, dangerous, and deficient. And human beings, we have the capacity to be polluters and parasites in a certain way. But fundamentally, I think more of the time, particularly in modern times, we're what I would call perfecting producers. We have the capacity to take naturally dirty parts of the environment, or of nature and to make them clean. And we also have the capacity to produce new resources in the sense of taking once useless raw materials and making them very valuable. So, for example, aluminum has existed as a chemical element, but it was completely useless until we figured out how to harness it. And oil was not a valuable resource until we figured out how to harness it. And shale oil or shale gas, which has recently become a resource, was not a resource until we figured out how to harness it. And uranium, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have this polluting parasite view of human beings, and that really defines your view of the world, you're going to predict all kinds of negative consequences from human beings impacting nature, versus if you recognize, and I think it is recognizing that human beings have this ability to be a perfecting producer, then you will also, and you will also look for very positive kinds of impacts. You'll think, oh, human beings have the capacity to change the world to make it better. And when you hear about an impact, you won't necessarily assume that it's bad, let alone catastrophic. But in practice, because people have these unacknowledged assumptions about how nature works, when they hear predictions or when they make predictions, it just seems natural that, oh yeah, well, if we impact nature, nature's going to punish us. But this is a very religious hell narrative type of thing. Like, we did the wrong thing by nature and nature is going to bite us in the ass. But that really have to acknowledge, okay, that's an assumption. And that by itself is not a complete assumption at all about how the world works. So number 3 is acknowledge your assumptions. And then number 4 is define your ultimate goal. And what this means is define, when we're evaluating technology or a policy or a product, we want for ourselves to know, and we want to know what the person evaluating the thing or assessing the thing believes is the ultimate goal. So if someone's assessing Facebook or vaccines or prescription drugs or fossil fuels, ultimately the question is, what is the goal or purpose that you're trying to achieve in using the thing? And that's going to then determine how you assess it. And the way I think of it is that the ultimate goal then serves as a standard by which you can measure something as good or bad. So if you're measuring the positive or negative potential of Facebook, you ultimately want to know, okay, what's my ultimate goal? And for me, the ultimate goal is always some form of human flourishing, human beings living up to their highest potential. And sometimes we're focused on it in an individual way. And sometimes when we're dealing with the potential of different kinds of shared risks, like we are when we talk about our energy systems and potential global impacts of CO2 or other emissions, then we need to talk about human flourishing in a more aggregate way that accounts for all the individuals, but that also accounts for their different kinds of impacts on others. So I think when I'm assessing fossil fuels, I want to think about it in terms of maximum human flourishing. And what's really important about a goal or a standard is that it's not at all necessary that people are clear about it or consistent about it. Usually in life, people aren't very consistent about what their goals are at all, or consistent about pursuing them, and certainly in their thinking. And what I find in energy and environmental issues is that, particularly to the extent people have this fragile nurturer view of nature, they often treat the ultimate goal as being natural. And there's a certain logic to this, because if nature really is this fragile nurturer and it's stable, safe, and sufficient, then maybe our goal that we should be pursuing is just to be as natural as possible, which means to have as little impact as possible. There's a certain kind of logic to that, and you hear it. But if you view, no, the planet is really this wild potential, then the view is much more, it's actually good to be unnatural a lot, in the sense of having a lot of impact. And so then the ultimate goal is human flourishing. And then we want to impact the world as much as we can positively, and just to avoid negative impacts. So it's a huge issue, though, in the energy discussion, because sometimes people's ultimate goal and standard is being green or minimizing human impact. And then sometimes it's maximizing human flourishing. And my view is it should always be maximizing human flourishing. And we should think of the environmental impacts as a means to that. So we should impact nature if and to the extent it's good for human flourishing and not to the extent that it's not. But if we have the goal as minimizing human impact, that's going to hurt human flourishing because it's going to view with a lot of skepticism and suspicion all the different ways we can improve the world, such as, in my view, producing fossil fuels and nuclear power, which I believe on net are incredibly, incredibly beneficial. So that is the framework. Explain the evidence, seek the full context, acknowledge your assumptions, and define your ultimate goal. That's what I try to hold myself to, and that's what I hold other people to. And I suggest that you hold people to that. And I think that when you start doing this, you'll see, oh my gosh, most of what is out there is just total trash. Even smart people, they're just not doing this. And then that can help us raise the level of discussion and ultimately demand that producers of claims hold themselves to higher standards, and then we as knowledge consumers can get better information. So that is my current version of the human flourishing framework for evaluating different kinds of content. And just one final observation on that is the framework that is being used today in our knowledge system today, which our culture works, it's so bad, it violates the right principles so thoroughly that it can literally confuse food and poison. It can literally tell us that something that's really good for us overall is really bad for us because it has all of those deep problems. It's not explaining, it's not seeking the full context, it's not acknowledging assumptions, and it's not defining an ultimate goal. So I hope that that's helpful to you and that you also hold us to those standards. Of course, we can't always explain every detail of everything, but in general, these are practices you should see from us. And if you don't, you should hold us to account, particularly in long things like the moral case for fossil fuels or the moral case for fossil fuels 2.0, which I think will do a much better job of using this kind of framework.